Am I crazy or do I want a Seiko? Hi everyone and welcome to Shaluso and to another episode of Watch on My Mind. And today we're talking about a brand new Seiko. Not a Grand Seiko, regular Seiko. And that is the Seiko Presage Sharp Edge GMT that was just released last week. And honestly, I don't think I've ever wanted a regular Seiko as much as this one. I'm actually genuinely entertaining the idea. For me, like Grand Seiko has always had an appeal, but the regular Seikos, all respect to them, they never really the bug never bit me, they never had that appeal. But this is something really, really interesting. Let's start out with a little bit of basic history. So this really traces its lines back to 2009 with the Seiko Ananta GMT, which was very similar to this in that it was GMT, power reserve, ceramic bezel or ceramic looking bezel at least, and a much more intricate design. It was essentially one of the first high-end Seikos that didn't cross over into being a Grand Seiko. And it had a very avant-garde design. It was inspired by the blades of a katana. It even had a spring drive movement on the inside. However, it was still very Seiko, still very sporty, so it still had that sort of denotation. Fast forward to 2020, and last year they released the Presage Sharp Edge, of which the watch we're talking about today is a variation on. And the Sharp Edge is a lot more like a Grand Seiko. You can tell that in the case shape. You can tell that in the fact that it has such an interesting dial. I'll put a link in the description below and on the card in the corner to Engineer Watanabe's video about the Presage Sharp Edge. He gives a good hands-on show of what it's like, especially looking at how that dial plays in the light, as well as his impressions on how it compares to a Grand Seiko in terms of finishing, look, quality, etc. So make sure you check that out. But the Sharp Edge really helped to bring up Seiko in terms of what the upper end of things was, while still offering very competitive pricing. Over the last few years, Seiko in general has been moving its pricing up. On the one hand, because there's space in the market to do so, and on the other, because for the longest time, they've probably been undercutting themselves with how much value they've offered. And then we have the release of the new Sharp Edge GMT, which is what we're talking about today. Right away, you can see the similarities with last year's release. It still has that texture pattern on the dial, which is known as asanoha. It's named after hemp leaves that are normally printed on Japanese clothing. So it's interesting just in how, for a Seiko, they managed to bring in, again, a lot more of this story. Usually this sort of story and references to Japanese culture, especially when it comes to marketing them, they'll reserve that for Grand Seikos, in terms of putting that front and center. Whereas this is a Seiko in which they're still bothering to do that. They're taking inspiration, so it really does bridge the gap a lot more between Seiko and Grand Seiko and blurs the lines a lot, much in the same way that the Prospex LX does. They're really bringing the two brands closer in terms of the bottom end of Grand Seiko and the top end of Seiko, and this is just another extension of that effort. In addition, of course, to the beautiful textured dial, it still retains a very Grand Seiko-esque case shape, not strictly the grammar of design. However, you can definitely tell that they are moving for that sort of look. Same with the bracelet as well. In terms of measurements, it's a 42.2 millimeter by 13.7 millimeters thick. So even getting a bit towards Grand Seiko dimensions as well, we're seeing those lines blend a lot more. And it's topped off with a fixed ceramic bezel, or at least ceramic look. They haven't confirmed it, but all indications point to it being ceramic. It has a similar sort of texture, and it has a very interesting dial layout. Now, before I get into the mechanics of it, just looking at that dial, the layout is extremely unconventional. First off, you have at 6 o'clock what looks like a small seconds register until you realize it goes from 1 to 31. It's actually a date register. Then it has the power reserve and the GMT, which are a bit more where you'd expect. The power reserve, of course, put off almost arbitrarily to the side, which is often the case with a lot of Grand Seiko spring drive movements. They have power reserves that seem like they're a bit of an afterthought, but it's kind of a trademark for Grand Seiko. So again, you see that sort of parallel as well as the descendants from the original 2009 Ananta. But the big highlight is the movement on this. The 6R64 is an in-house caliber, albeit only 45 hours of power reserve, but it has a power reserve indicator, a date, and a proper GMT. This isn't like it is on my Steinhardt, for example, where it's the GMT hand that jumps around and you have a quick set. No, this is one where it's actually the hour hand that jumps that controls the date as well. And that in general is much more user-friendly, especially if you're using this watch to travel. If you're staying in one place and you're just looking at different time zones, it doesn't really matter, but it makes a huge difference when you're traveling because it means you don't have to change your minutes, you don't have to unsync your watch by hacking the seconds. It makes a big difference when you actually travel, and more importantly, it's just more true to form. It's true to what GMT watches are supposed to be like, for lack of a better way to put it. And there isn't really much competition in this price bracket for something featuring that. Nearly everything in this price bracket will feature an ETA 2893 or a Sellita SW330, which works on the same principle as my Steinhardt, works on the same principle as the Panerai Luminor GMT as well, which is a 7750 base movement. At the end of the day, there are ETA movements modified to include a GMT, and they work on just having a moving GMT hand, which also, when it comes to setting a watch, can sometimes be annoying if you forget that the GMT and the quick set are operated at the same crown position. If you flip it up though, it changes the date. If you flip it down, it changes the GMT hand. This is more in the vein of a Rolex GMT Master, an Omega Planet Ocean GMT, or a Tudor Black Bay GMT, or any of the other more high-end GMT watches. And when we're talking about price, this all comes for a price of only $1,400 US. It has a ton of different variations. Initially, the black one was my favorite, but actually I'm really starting to warm to the brown dial just because it's something a little bit different. The tone of brown, I think, is very, very classy, and it has almost a quasi two-tone effect because it has a sort of reddish gold plated GMT hand, which gives it a little bit of a different flair to the usual black and red that I would normally gravitate towards. And in terms of how this stacks up to other watches, well, there's two ways to look at it. You can look upmarket, look at something like the Grand Seiko Sport Collection GMT. I'm terrible with reference numbers, so you'll see that on the infographic though. That comes in around $3,200 US. You can get it for a little cheaper on pre-owned, but that's a quartz. Mind you, it's a 9F quartz, so it's a very high-end quartz, but it is still a quartz. It doesn't have the ceramic bezel. It doesn't have the open case back. Obviously, it may have better finishing, but from a movement perspective, you're doing a lot of compromise. Then if you look further down market, something like a Steinhardt Ocean 1 GMT in titanium, that definitely hands down beats the Seiko in terms of features, on paper at least. You know, it's made of titanium, 500 meter water resistance, has a much better looking movement because the 6R64 is pig ugly. That's just being honest. But on the other hand, even this one, which is the least homage looking of the Steinhardt Ocean 1 GMTs, is not as bad, for example, as my Coke bezel Steinhardt. It still carries that baggage of looking like an homage watch, and for some people that won't matter, but for others they want something that looks a little bit distinctive and that they don't have to explain away or think that they're, you know, having a watch that kind of pretends to be something it's not. Of course, there's plenty of watches, you know, that use an ETA 2893 or a Sellita SW330 that aren't homage watches, but the majority, especially in this price bracket specifically, sub $1,500, they will most likely be leaning on homage territory, so you're a bit limited in your options. So this has really got me thinking because, you know, for a while I've wanted to replace my Steinhardt, and what better thing to replace it with than a Seiko? Remember, my Steinhardt occupies also my role as sort of a beater watch, so in that sense, a lot of it is making sense. I'd really like to have it in hand to test it out and see how it actually is, but even just from the footage I've seen of last year's three-hander Presage Sharp Edge, it definitely looks quite promising. But let me know in the comments below, what do you think of this new release? Is this something you would entertain if you were faced between that choice of spending just over double the amount to get the quartz Grand Seiko or saving about $600 and getting something like the Steinhardt? Which would you buy and why? I'd love to know your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. And also let me know, do you know of any true GMTs that you can get for $1,400 US? Of course, if you like this video, make sure you like it and share it. If you want to see more of the infographics and pictured featured throughout this video as well as all my others, make sure you follow me on Instagram at Shaluso. And if you want to keep seeing more videos of watches, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell as well so you know when the next video comes out. In any case, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.